And I'd also like to thank the friends at Camarillo Library and, of course, the Camarillo Public Library and everyone who was involved in selecting Etched in Sand to be the Camarillo One City, One Book Read for 2018. And I especially want to thank the leadership of the library and Brenda Goldie for putting this great event together. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your Sunday to come here on such a beautiful day. I really appreciate it. Thank you. So I'm going to ask you a few questions. And after those questions, so I can kind of gauge the audience and learn a little bit about you. And then after that, what I'll do is I'll share my story with you, which I'll walk through from beginning to end, but share, if you've read the book, in a narrative way, maybe some things that you didn't know. After that, I'll tell you the 2 reasons why I wrote Etched in Sand and the impact that it's had, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So first, I want to ask, who here has read Etched in Sand? Oh my. Who here hasn't read Etched in Sand? Okay, all right, that's helpful. Who here has read Etched in Sand sequel, Girl Unbroken? Who started to read it? Oh, they. Okay, all right, well that's good. So we could talk about that a little bit as well. Okay, so also in the audience, who here is a librarian or works at a library? Because you're going to get shout outs in the book, as I speak. Who is a teacher, an educator? Okay. Administrator of the school, coaches? Okay. What about caseworkers and social workers? We have 1. We've got 2, 3. Okay, former counselor, therapist. Any therapists in here? Okay, thank you. What about just generally anyone who works in the world of child welfare? That could be anything. That could be a variety of different groups here. Okay, thank you. Well, and of course in the room, the most important job of all, who here are parents? All right, I thought so. Well, that is actually helpful, so I know who it is that I'm speaking with. So now I'm going to share my story with you. So I was born to a woman who had 5 kids by 5 different men. She was mentally ill. She didn't get properly diagnosed at the time, and she certainly wasn't receiving the treatment that she needed. So she self-medicated through drugs and alcohol. And this woman who was mentally ill and drug and alcohol addicted actually ended up going ahead and having 5 kids by 5 different men. Now, she clearly couldn't take care of herself, let alone the 5 kids that she had. So what she would do is she would find us places to live on Long Island in New York. And where we lived on Long Island is a county called Suffolk County, which is the eastern part of the county. But it's like any other suburban county that you would find. There are places that are of high wealth, there are places that are middle income and low income, and you have that mix throughout the entire county. So this is where we lived when we were younger and when we were with our mother. And when we were with her, what she would do is she would find us places to live. And sometimes we would live out of houses or apartments. But we were never there too long because we would end up getting evicted. Because my mother knew how to kind of manipulate the social service system. She knew that if she needed an apartment or a house, she would go and she would get 1 month's rent and 1 month's security from the welfare office, and she would give that to a landlord, and she knew that that would maybe take us 3 or 4 months in one living place, because by the time she stopped paying the 2nd month's rent and the 3rd month's rent, then the eviction process started. So we'd always end up getting evicted, but for at least a little bit of time we were able to live in houses or apartments. And the other places that we lived, that she would find us to live, was behind supermarkets, out of cars, on the streets, in homeless shelters, and when the authorities figured out what was going on with us, they would pick us up and put us into separate foster homes. And but when we were with our mother, meaning that when we weren't in the foster care system, she would find us these places to live and just leave us there for weeks at a time. And we had to figure out how it was we were going to survive. And one of the most important things that we needed to do was get food. And the only way that we were able to efficiently do that, because we really didn't have too much money or food stamps or anything at the same time, is we had to learn how to steal food to eat. So we did that very thoughtfully. And there were 5 of us. So at least when we went to go steal food, we had a decoy, who was my younger sister Rosie. She was the baby. She was the cutest one of them all, so she was a good detraction. And my sister Sherry, the oldest one, was usually the lookout. And the 3 kids in the middle, and I was the middle of 5, we were the soldiers that really had to do, some of the work. And how we stole food was based on seasons. I mean, for an example, when we would go to a supermarket in the middle of winter, it was actually easier because we would have these coats, and back then these snorkel coats were out. I know they're back in style. And we would get them by going dumpster diving. That's how we got our clothes. I mean, we jumped into Salvation Army bins, we got a bunch of stuff and kind of threw it out. So we tried to get these big coats out of there that didn't particularly fit us, but it was still a coat to stay warm. So we would wear them to go food shopping, and what we would do is we would put holes in the pockets. So when we walked down certain aisles, we knew if there's something that we were going to buy, we kind of slip it in the pocket, but then kind of push it towards the back of the coat to kind of hide it a little bit so we could fit more things in there. But when it wasn't winter, we had to come up with other ways to steal food. And one of the things that I was responsible for was getting food that came in like flat boxes or plastic bags that kind of flattened out, which I'll explain in a moment. So what I did is I'd walk into a supermarket, all 5 of us would walk in, but I'd walk up and down the aisles, and I'd try to find the aisle that had the macaroni and cheese, the Jiffy muffin mix, English muffins, the powdered milk, things that you could actually put flat in a box. So after I located them, I'd walk to the back of the store and I'd go find a box boy. Those are the guys who broke up the boxes. I know we call them associates now, but they were called box boys back then. So I would ask them for two boxes that were the egg carton boxes, and I'd flip open the flaps, and I'd take the box by this end and kind of walk down the aisle so it looked like it was empty and open. And then when I get down the aisle that I needed to, I'd lift up the top box, I'd put in the muffins, I'd put in the powdered milk and things along that line, push it down, and I'd walk out the store. And so that's one of the things that I did, but we each had our own role. And the role of my oldest sister, Sherry, was to always make sure that she scrounged up enough pennies or quarters or a food stamp to buy the one thing that we could never ever figure out how to buy. Because first of all, 5 kids can't walk into a supermarket and not buy anything, right? So someone has to buy something. And then her job as the lookout was to make sure that after we left, she'd buy the one thing that we could never figure out how to steal, that was bulky, that we really needed. What do you think it was? Toilet paper, right? That was her job. So that was one way that we used to get food. But another way is Long Island at the time had a lot of farms. And so we at nighttime would walk however far it was that we could walk. We needed to walk to the closest farm. And once we got to the farm, we'd get down on our bellies, we'd do the belly shuffle and grab as many vegetables as we could, and then we'd take off. And that worked well and good until one day a farmer came out with a shotgun. And then we decided we had to change our MO. So another way that we would get food was beaches. And we didn't have to steal food when we went to the beach. You could take things from the beach, right? We would take mussels, we would go clamming. There were other things that we would get there as well. But we went to the beach not only because we were able to get food for free and it wasn't stealing, but it was also a place that we felt comfortable. Because by the time I was, 5 or 6, 7 years old, around that time, I was already being told that I was different. Like, people were treating me differently too. And I was like any other kid. Meaning that, what a child looks for when he goes outside is another child. Kind of like puppies, right? Puppies want to find other puppies to play with. Kids want to find other kids to play with. And I would go to try to find other kids to play with. And their parents would take a look at me and realize that I was a kid who really wasn't getting bathed because no one was telling me to take a bath or a shower. I had terrible dental hygiene because we didn't really have a toothbrush. We were stealing food to eat, and the only thing that we had that was close to a toothbrush had flattened bristles because we had to share it amongst the 5 of us. So we had terrible dental hygiene. And as far as washing clothes, I was washing my own clothes. So you can imagine what they look like on me. And my mother never taught me how to blow my nose. So you can imagine what a complete mess I was. And but I would still want to go out and still want to play with other kids. And when there were parents who would see me trying to engage their children, they would tell me to stay away from them because I was different. But when I went to a beach, and my siblings and I went there, what do you do when you go to a beach? It's great. You have a bathing suit on, you have some clothes, you take the clothes off, you go into the water, we'd clean off, we'd look like every other kid there, except we were always a tad bit thinner. And it was a place that we were able to fit in. So that's what we would try to find, is places where we would fit in that we wouldn't stick out, which was kind of a theme of how it is that we grew up we best avoided people not paying attention to us because we didn't want them to come and take us and separate us and put it into foster care. So these are some of the things that we did when our mother wasn't around. But when she would come back in our lives after her, several weeks long drunken binge, she would then try to register us in school. And she registered us in school based upon her own suspicions. And so if she was not suspicious that the heat was going to get her, because she was always concerned she was going to be arrested because she had so many warrants out for her arrest, that she was concerned that once she registered us in school, that the police were going to come, take us, and bring her to jail. But the reality is that this was the 1970s. The only way communication that anyone had between like two even public entities was a yellow phone on a wall with that really long cord. So it wasn't as if when we walked into schools that a teacher would pick up the yellow phone and call the police. Can you give me a background check on these 5 kids and the mother? I mean, it wasn't happening. I don't even think they had background checks back then. But in my mother's mind, with her psychosis, she was very paranoid. So she would at least register us in school once in a while. And for us, when we were registered in school, it did this great journey for us and a great experience, because we would walk into a place that was temperature controlled, that was warm in the winter and cool in the summer. We would be in a place where the electricity worked, where there was clean running water and operating bathrooms. When a child lives on the fringe of society, they don't have many of these things. So when we walked into school, we were just comfortable because we knew that we were going to have these amenities at the school. The other thing that we would get is a free lunch, because the administration would take one look at us and realize that we needed to be fed. So at least we knew we were going to have a meal a day. And of course, the third benefit of being there is we had the opportunity to be educated. And like I said, we were never there too long, but at least for that little bit of time that we were there, we were able to be educated. And then my mother would take us out, and then she'd go somewhere else, and then she would register us in school as well. That's, again, if she wasn't worried about the heat being on her. But for that time when she was being paranoid and didn't want to register us in school, or during the summers, we needed to find another place that was just like a school. Where do you think it was? A library. Yep. So my siblings and I would walk miles sometimes to just go to a library, because we'd be walking into a place that was temperature controlled, right? Electricity works, clean running water, operating bathrooms, same amenities that we had at school. We didn't get a free lunch, but it was an opportunity for us to get educated in a way. And because there were 5 of us, we were all learning at different levels. So I would have my older sisters teach me, and I would be teaching my younger siblings. But I also want to be realistic. It's not as if 5 kids walk into a library and they all sat down and started reading at one time. I don't think that's ever happened. Has that ever happened here? I'm pretty sure it's never happened. So we had to find things to do to engage ourselves and engage our younger siblings. So there was one magazine that we would scour the entire library for so many copies, because we knew that would keep us busy, because it had a lot of activities in it. Do you know which one that is? Highlight magazine, yep. So that for us was this great savior if a place had highlight magazines, because it would keep us all busy. And then once in a while we'd settle down and read. And I was this ferocious reader as a child. And there was a librarian at one of the libraries who then showed me a series of books about U.S. historic figures. And the series was called the Landmark series. It was published, I see a lot of nodding heads, it was published in the 1950s for elementary age students. And it has over 100 books in the series, and it includes books on U.S. historic figures. So I started reading stories about George Washington, John Adams, Abraham Lincoln, it goes on and on. So I started reading all of these books, Thomas Jefferson, and what I was reading about people who were living in very challenging times, who didn't have a lot of resources, who had tremendous obstacles that they had to overcome, and not only overcame those obstacles, but went on to do something good. That's what the theme was in those stories. But I wanted more, and quite frankly, I want to read some stories about women. So there were actually 3 books out of this whole series that were published about women who were born in the U.S. Betsy Ross, Dolly Madison, and Pocahontas. So she was definitely born here. So after I read those books, and there was the same themes that were in that books, but I wanted more on women. So there was another librarian that showed me a book on Amelia Earhart that was written for my age. And I was just in awe of her. And after I read her story, I tried to read every possible book I could find on her, even one that was written for adults. Because I was reading about a woman who was born during a certain era where societal norms were dictating what her future was going to be. Society was telling her, you are going to be married young, you're going to have babies, you're not going to work, and this is what your life is going to be. And she pushed back against those norms. And she was gutsy and she was fearless. And by the time I started reading about Amelia when I was 7, I remembered what people were telling me that I was going to be when I was older. I was already being told at the age of 7 that I was going to be a drug and alcohol addicted teenage pregnant mother who beat up her kids and abandoned her kids and went to jail and is homeless. Because that is exactly what my mother was, and people were telling me I was going to turn out just like her. But then I was thinking of Amelia, someone who pushed back against what people said, disregarded it, even though society was telling her what path she was going to go down, and she was gutsy and fearless. So these are the things that we did to try to entertain ourselves when our mother wasn't all that present. But when she came back into our lives and she would spend time with us, she would abuse us. And the abuse that we were subjected to was brutal. And this day and age, if any parent did that, they would automatically have their the custody removed from their children. I mean, they would lose custody of their children and they would be incarcerated. But back then it was a different era. So we were living with a woman who not only abandoned us and neglected us, but also really physically abused us as well. But we preferred to do that. We preferred to be with her because during our youth also we were placed in foster homes. And when the authorities would pick us up, there were 5 of us. They would put us in separate foster homes. And when we would get back together under the care of our mother, we would tell the stories of what happened to us in those foster homes. And some of the foster homes we were in were fantastic. And I made sure I mentioned that in Etched Sound. I want to make it very clear there were very, very good foster parents. There are very bad foster parents, and there are those that are in between. It's always a mix. But we had very good foster parents, and we would share those stories for those of us who were fortunate enough to be placed in a good home. But then, of course, some of us were placed in homes that weren't good. And back then, you didn't have background checks on foster parents. So when you place little kids in some of these homes, you can imagine what happened. So as we would share these stories with each other, we were convinced that the reason why some of this stuff happened to us in these bad homes is because we were separated. Because if we were together, it wouldn't have happened. Because we would have tried to protect one another from what actually occurred. So we made a pact. I mean, we were very young when we made this pact. I was the middle. I was about 8 years old at this time after I got out of my last foster home when I was 7 at that time. And then Camille's 3 years older than me, so she was 11, and Sherry was 12, and then our younger brother and sister, we called them the kids, because we basically were parenting them, so we would take care of the kids. They were our kids. That was the term that we used, and they were much younger. But the older ones made a pact that we would never, ever, ever let anyone know how it was that we were living. And we always had a story. And the story was based on what time of day it was. Because my mother would work. I mean, she would get jobs. She would never stay in there too long. But what she did is when she would get these jobs, she really wouldn't want to work them. So she'd take one of the kids with her. So they'd be doing the work. So we learned what she was doing and where she was doing it. So when we were asked where our mother was at 3:30 in the morning, if the police would come knocking on the door, we'd say she's working. And when they asked where, we said she's working for a bakery. The bakery that makes the bagels, her job is to deliver the bagels to the delis before the delis open up at 5 a.m. in the morning. Because that's what we would do. We would be on the truck with her doing that. And if they asked where she was at 7 in the morning, after the bagels were delivered, we said she was working at a deli, because she would work at delis from time to time and make potato salad and things along that line. And then when they asked where she was during the day, we said she's a real estate agent, because she had that job once, but it really covered like 8 hours during the day, so we thought that was good cover. And when we were asked where she was at nighttime, we said she's a barmaid. So we did everything we possibly could to kind of keep our story straight so we wouldn't get separated. And then a few years after that, as we were managed to survive during this time, something changed in our family dynamic. My 2 older sisters started leaving our home. And I'm saying that metaphorically because we never really had a home, but it was wherever we lived, because they just wanted to be teenagers. I mean, I was 11, turning 12, and they clearly were teenagers at that point, and they just wanted to be a teenager. So they wanted to go to their friend's house, they wanted to sleep on the couches, go to school from there. They didn't want the responsibility of raising us anymore, because literally they spent their entire life raising my younger siblings and I. Now they were passing the baton to me. Now it was my responsibility to raise the kids. And this is what happens. This is very normal for kids who are impoverished and living on the fringe of society. When their parents aren't stepping in to parent them, it's the older siblings who end up being responsible for the younger siblings. And at a certain point, these older siblings just want to be kids, because that's what they still are. And many of them do leave the home and then pass the baton down. So that's ultimately what happened. And so for a few years, we were doing okay. I mean, we ended up living in a trailer without any heat in the winter, which wasn't all that fun. And then we were in homeless shelters and a few other places. But I managed to get through, and my sisters were never too far, and they would come by and drop stuff off, or give food stamps, or give money and things along that line. But I was really the primary caretaker. And that worked well and good up until the time I was about to turn 14 years old, just a few weeks before I was 14. Something happened that drastically changed my ability not to share our story. My mother came home from a drunken binge, and I was at, we were actually in a house, and she came home from a drunken binge, and the first thing she wanted to do was beat up my sister Rosie. Now, in my mind, my sister Rosie's the baby, and I have been her parent for the past few years, so she's now trying to beat up my baby. So my mother is a very large woman because she drank so much. So she's really large because of the amount of alcohol that she had. And so she went to go beat up my little sister, and by this time I'm emaciated. I'll tell you how bad it was. It was right before she came home. I remember looking at myself in the mirror, and I was wearing a tube top and a pair of shorts, and I realized there's nothing else that was going on, really. I had flesh, but I didn't have any real fat on my body at all, and my skin looked translucent, as if you could kind of see through it when you don't have any substance, underneath there. And not only that, but I was missing hair on my head, because when a child suffers from malnutrition, they get bald spots. And then I also had streaks of gray. So I was emaciated, and the reason why is because at that point things were getting pretty bad. So every time that we received any kind of food, I would give it to my younger siblings, because I would rather have them eat than me eat. And I did two things to try to keep my energy up. One of them was I would drink vinegar. And I don't know how I figured this out, I'm pretty sure it was probably by drinking pickle juice, which I loved, is once I drank vinegar, my appetite would be suppressed. So when somebody would ask, or my sisters would ask, like, what do you need? I would say vinegar, because I could use it to clean, I could put it on salad, but the reality is that I was drinking that because it was suppressing my appetite when I needed it. And the other thing that I would do is I would find my mother's drugs, because she always had a pile of something somewhere, whether it was in a car or something else, and in it, I would go scout, always looking for food stamps or quarters and stuff like that, and looking for her drugs. And her drugs, they were very simple back then. There were two types. She had uppers and downers. So I knew the downers were what put you to sleep, but the uppers is what would give you energy. So then I would start taking her uppers as well, to try to give myself energy to get through the day. So if we had food, I didn't have to consume as much as I thought I would. And so by this time, my mother, so this was going on for months leading up to this, and by this time when my mother came home came home and then started beating up my little sister, I was just a bag of bones at that point. And I started pulling my mother off of my sister. And the rule in our house is that if one of us is getting beat up, you have to let them get beat up. Because if you jump in to try to protect them, they're going to get beat up more. Not that you're going to get beat up, they're going to get beat up more. So we had to make calculated decisions sometimes, like when do we go to protect our siblings in front of with our mother, or when do we pull back? But I wasn't being rational, I wasn't thinking about this. But I did jump in, and luckily my mother directed her anger towards me, and I ended up getting, I think, what was the worst beating I ever got from her. And it was likely because it was not a beating that was any worse than she ever gave me in the past, but my body wasn't able to absorb it, so the way that I looked afterwards was pretty horrific. So after that, and my mother left, I still had to put the kids to bed, wake them up in the morning, get them on the school bus, send them off. And I got on the later bus to get to school because I wanted that free meal. So I went to school, and later that day I had a teacher pull me out of class. And it was November, so I was able to wear like clothes over what I had, over the marks that I had on my body. But it was difficult to kind of cover up what was in my face. But it was the 1980s at this point, so I had a lot of hair back then. So I would walk around with like my hair down like this to kind of cover my face. So I thought I was doing a good enough job, but one of my teachers saw that I really wasn't hiding what was under there, and he pulled me out, and he told me I was failing. And this was Mr. Brown, my social studies teacher, and he said, Regina, you're failing, and but we can fix that if you tell me what's going on at home. I know something's going on at home, and I refused to tell him. And he kept asking me, and I refused to tell him. And he said, if I tell you, I'll help you pass. And I still refused to tell him. But that day I went home, and there was a caseworker in the driveway. And you know that because the cars are 4-door gray sedans. I mean, we knew what it was by then. They weren't getting any like fancier cars from there. So as soon as I saw that in the driveway, I knew what I was going to be facing. And I walked into the house. And she's looking in the cabinets and then taking a look at me and starts asking me what happened, and I refused to tell her, and she's asking over and over again, and I refused to tell her. And when she lifts my shirt and actually sees the damage on my chest and my back, and she said, Regina, you have to tell me what's going on here, because if you don't tell me, you're not going to survive, and your siblings are not going to survive. You have to tell me. And I still didn't want to tell her, but when, to explain away the bruises and the cuts, I said, I fell down the stairs, I fell out of a tree, I got in a fight with my brother, an iron fell on me, because I thought these were all original stories. But apparently they're told them all over by every kid out there, so she wasn't buying that either. So then she said to me, I can help you with this, because you're going to be 14 in 3 days, and you know what that means. And I did know what it meant. It meant that I could become emancipated. Because in New York State, at the age of 14, back in 1980, you can emancipate yourself from your parent if you had enough evidence to bring before a judge. And I knew this because I was a street kid. Because street kids, we know all this stuff. Like, you know how to avoid the truant officer. I don't know if we still have truant officers, but back then we did. You know how long you can stay away from your house without being, declared a runaway. And how many days you could be off of school without them trying to suspend you. Like, you learn all these rules, how do you, you're living this life without bringing too much attention to yourself. So I also knew when it was I can be on my own, because that's all we ever want to do, is just be on our own and not be under, our mother's darkness. So we knew that at 14, if we are emancipated, we could leave our mother. Or at 16, we could just leave and she would never look for us again, and the cops won't look for us, and that'll be just fine. So she told me if I tell her my story, that she can take that evidence and go to a judge and get the judge to try to emancipate me from my mother. But that wasn't good enough, because it wasn't about me, it was about the kids. And then she said, and then what we'll do is we'll ask him also to remove your mother's guardianship rights over your younger siblings with the evidence that you present. And she said, then at least they have an opportunity for a better life. And I caved. And for the first time, the thought of them actually having a better life is what broke me. And I ended up telling her everything that has been going on with my mother throughout our entire young existence with her. And my sisters weren't there to stop me from doing it, my older sisters, and I just broke. So the next day, we all went to school again, and when I came home from school, I saw the worst thing that any kid in and out of foster care could ever see in a driveway. 2 cars. One of them took Camille and I, my older sister, they tracked her down and I, to one foster home, and the other one took Rosie and Norman to a separate one. So we were again separated, and this time it was my fault, because I'm the one who broke the pact. So we got to this foster home, and right away my sister Sherry just joined us there. She came over, and we started working on the affidavit, because we knew that was the most important thing that we needed to do. And we did it in a few days, and my sisters helped me with the information, and we signed it. And my caseworker submitted it to the judge to begin the emancipation process. And like I said, that was in November. And in December, right before Christmas, on December 21st, my mother went to go visit my 2 younger siblings. But before she went to go visit them, she got wind of what I was trying to do, that I was trying to take her rights away. And the way she saw my younger sibling, the way she saw all of us were welfare checks. She had 5 welfare checks. She had 5 kids, right? Sherry was now out of the house. And even though so she and married at this point, so she wasn't getting a welfare check for her anymore, but she was still going to get for the 4 of us. So even if Camille and I were out of the house, she would still, except if we were in foster care, she wouldn't. But if we were back with her, she still would. But now that all 4 of us are in foster care, She's not getting any welfare checks anymore. So when she found out that I was trying to take her kids away from her and her 2 welfare checks, she went to that foster home on December 21st and removed them. And this day and age, that would be called kidnapping. So after that happened, we immediately called our caseworker and begged her to start looking for my mother and call the police. And, you know, she did the little bit that she could do, but she basically said, you know what, maybe she'll be okay. Maybe she can't handle 5 of you, but maybe she can handle just 2 of you. So they really didn't track her down too much. And then didn't take too much for them they didn't put too much energy into actually bringing her in and taking the kids away again. But then what she also said, you know what, it's right before Christmas, we're all busy, so why don't you call me after the New Year's and we'll see what we can do. So again, after the New Year, Sherry, Camille, and I were calling social services over and over again saying you can't leave the kids with her. We know what she's going to do to them. We especially know what she's going to do at Rosie, because my mother abused the girls and didn't abuse my brother. Because she was brought up in a household where her brother was deemed a prince, and she was abused, so my mother was beaten, her brother wasn't, so she kind of carried that down to our family. So the fact that she had Rosie with her and none of us were there to protect her Rosie was really what concerned us. And so social services put a little effort into it, but basically ultimately ended up giving her custody back, and she took them after that and she went to Idaho. Completely got out of the state. So now the biggest worry for us is that we weren't going to be able to have these kids nearby. We couldn't go check on them or sneak around and see how they are, or go see them when my mother wasn't there. They were in Idaho. So here I was in this foster home. I'm on my way to be emancipated, but my 2 younger siblings are now in another state. So for the next few years, what I did, I was constantly getting on the phone over and over again with authorities in Idaho. I would call caseworkers and social workers and schools and the police department, try to track down wherever they were. And when I find out where they were, I would call those specific schools and I would say what was happening, like who my mother was, the danger that Rosie was going to be in, and they can't, and she lost the kids here in New York, so she shouldn't have the kids there. Can you please go and watch her? And I would then call Suffolk Social Services and tell the county I was in and tell them, please talk to the people in Idaho, and they refused to, because they said the kids are out of state, that they don't deal with children who are out of state. So all the evidence that we had in Suffolk County, they weren't willing to share it with people in Idaho, and Idaho wasn't willing to get on the phone with Suffolk County and even ask them, because what my mother would tell them when they would come around and ask about these allegations that we were making, she would tell them, oh, I know who's calling you. It's my daughter Regina. Well, she's a liar. I mean, this kid is a slut. She's a prostitute. She's a drug addict. That's why she's in foster care. And the caseworker believed her, because that's what people believed about foster kids. And unfortunately, sometimes they still do today. Not the fact that I had a bad parent, but that I had to be a bad kid because I was in foster care. So I had no credibility anymore to these people that I was calling in Idaho. And they would disregard every complaint I made and just listen to my mother. So I was here in the school and I had to figure out, I can't help them. I'm still a teenager here. All of us are still kids, even my 2 older sisters too. And I have to just deal with what's in front of me, and what was in front of me was school. I was now in a foster home, and I had the ability to actually be in this foster home for all 4 years, the same 4 years that I could go to high school, meaning I could go to the same school for 4 years. This is not something I was able to do. So while I was there, during the first year, I did get emancipated, and my caseworker came back to me and she said, congratulations, you're emancipated. But what that means is that when you turn 18, you're going to be kicked out of this foster home because they won't get money for you anymore, and you're going to be on your own, and you may end up homeless. So I'm going to teach you how to live independently by teaching you independent living skills. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. What do you mean I'm going to be homeless? If I'm emancipated, I'm freed for adoption. Won't someone want to adopt me? She's like, no. People don't adopt foster kids, especially older foster kids. Can you imagine at the age of 14 being told for the rest of your life, you will never have a safe place, you will never have a safety net, you'll never have a place to put your head down at nighttime, that you're completely on your own from here on out? So she decided the best thing to do was teach me independent living skills. And it was a 17-point checklist. And I promise you I'm not going to go through all 17 points. But what she would do, she would ask me these questions, and if I said I knew how to do it, she wasn't going to teach me. If I didn't know how to do it, she was going to teach me. So I'll just give you the 3 highlights. The first one was, well, when you're living on your own, you have to find an apartment and pay rent. Do you know how to pay rent? And I was like, no. She's like, okay, I'll teach you that. The second one, when you're living on your own and you have this apartment, you're going to have to call the power authority to put the power on. Do you know how to do that? And I said, well, I've answered the phone enough time when the power authority calls to say they're going to shut it off. I'm pretty sure I could figure out how to call them to tell them how to put it on. She's like, it's a different process. I'll teach you how to do that. So then the third question was, well, when you're living on your own, you have to go food shopping. Do you know how to go food shopping? And I was like, with or without money? So she was teaching me independent living skills, and I would go to school, and I would have these teachers that were telling me that I need to go to college. I'm smart enough to go to college, talented enough to go to college, and that the only way for me to determine my future is to go to college, and that is my only way out of poverty. And somehow my 9th grade English teacher ended up being my 10th grade English teacher, my 11th grade English teacher, and my 12th grade English teacher. This is Mr. Ferry. And Mr. Ferry, along the way, co-opted the guidance counselor and another of my social studies teachers. And the three of them worked over the next few years to put me in whatever AP class I could possibly get in, to try to give me a taste of getting college by getting these, college credits before college. Help me figure out ways to pay for it, because obviously I had to pay for it. And then they signed me up for the SAT, they signed me for the ACT, and they said, you're going to go to college. Don't worry about, being homeless. You're going to go to college. So I would go back to my caseworker and I would say, oh, you don't have to teach me these skills. I'm not going to be homeless. I'm going to go to college. She's like, what? I said, yeah, I'm going to go to college. I'm not going to be homeless. I'll figure it out when I go to college, but I'll find a place to live wherever I go, and that's where I'm going to go. She's like, why do you think you're going to college? And I would explain to her about Mr. Ferry and Mr. McGuire and the caseworker and all these classes and the AP and how they said I'm smart enough to go to college. And she's like, you're not going to go to college, Regina. And I said, well, why? Why are you saying this? She said, well, foster kids don't go to college. And when they do, they certainly don't graduate college. And you know what? She was right. Back then in the 1980s, less than 2% of the foster care population graduated college. You know what that percentage is today? Less than 3%. We moved the needle by 1% in 30 years. Because how could we expect our youth in need to be able to manage the emotional stress of college, let alone the financial one? Even if there's financial aid, there's an emotional stress of paying bills and figuring out how to get food and everything else all around that if they don't have anyone pushing them. It's so much easier to go and just drop out and go get a job when you don't have anyone encouraging you to continue going down that pathway to college. So that is why we have such a small percentage that graduated. But I chose to ignore her and listen to my teachers. And I went to college, and I started out at Stony Brook University, and my foster parents were not supportive of this. They didn't go to college. At that point, they didn't have any of their daughters go to college. They were older. The daughters ended up going much later, and any foster kid they never ever had never went to college. And so they thought it was a mistake on my part. But I wanted to go to college, and I was working while I was going to college nearby at a very large university, so I was still living in the foster home, and I'm dealing with the trauma of what is going on with my siblings over in Idaho. And I start failing out after 3 semesters because my caseworker was right. Foster kids, those who go, barely ever graduate. Because I was doing it basically on my own. Nobody was encouraging me there. I didn't have my teachers there. I was now in a large university where the entry-level classes or freshman classes were 100 to 1,000 people each. I couldn't survive in that type of environment. So I was dropping out after my first semester of my second year. And I called a friend of mine that I went to high school with, and she was going to a school in upstate New York called SUNY New Paltz, and it was a state school. And I told her I was dropping out, and she says, you can't do that. You got to continue. I said, I don't know how I'm going to do this. Like, I can't do it on my own. And she said, you should come here. And I said, why? I'm failing out. I doubt that they would accept me. She said, no, you should come here. You should come here because 8 of us from high school are going here. Now, if any of your children or grandchildren ever tell you that they want to go to a college because their 8 friends from high school are going, I'm pretty confident that's the college that you don't want them going to. But for me, this made sense. Because what were they going to provide me? Encouragement. They were going to be my safety net. I wasn't going to be doing it alone. It made absolute sense. And she was right. So I applied. I told them my story in an essay, explained why my GPA was so bad, and they admitted me, thank goodness. And they admitted me through an equal opportunity program, which is like an affirmative action program. And so I was able to get some extra money for books. So while I was there, during my first semester there, which was the second semester sophomore year, I decided I was going to change my major because maybe the problem I had at the first university was that I was a calculus major, and I just wasn't cut out for it. So I decided to change that, and I wanted to be a teacher because I wanted to be the teacher that my teachers were to me. And they had a great education program. So I signed up for education, took all teaching classes, but I had to take a class that fulfilled a history requirement. And the only class that fulfilled a history requirement was a class on international politics that was being held at 8:30 in the morning that I accidentally took. Because I don't think any 19-year-old in their right mind takes a class on international politics at 8:30 in the morning. But it fit my schedule, so I went. And I remember being there on the first day. My professor was Lou Brownstein, and he literally wanted to know who had voted in the last election. So we just had a presidential election. Who had voted in the last election? I don't even know if any hands went up at that point, but we were all 19, we were voting age. And then he wanted to know who there was registered to vote. Well, if you weren't registered to vote, your punishment was that you had to read President Reagan's State of the Union in the New York Times. And I raised my hand and I was like, what's the New York Times? Now, this was not a world I was ever exposed to, and the thought about voting was like, why do I care about anyone else? I'm still trying to survive here. So I was really concerned that I wasn't going to pass this class, and at the beginning I thought I should just drop it for now. But I'm glad I stuck with it, because during that semester I learned how people were living in Haiti and the Philippines under the dictatorship of Baby Doc Duvalier and the Marcos regime, and how the dictators of those countries were keeping all the money. And there wasn't enough jobs in that country for people. There wasn't a social service network. There certainly weren't any services that were available for homeless kids. And I then started learning about how some women were treated in some Middle Eastern countries where they weren't permitted to go to school. And then he taught us about all the countries in Africa, and some countries in Africa are very, very progressive, but there's some that aren't. And then if there are schools that only the boys go, and the girl's job is to go get up in the morning, go get water from a well and bring it back, that's if they made it back. And I remember learning about all these different countries out there and how people live and how children lived. And for the first time in my life, I actually felt lucky. Because I realized that if my siblings and I were born into any of those other countries, we wouldn't have survived. We would have been sold into a sex slave. We would have been child warriors. We just wouldn't have survived because there was no safety net to kind of catch us. And I really realized how lucky we were. Because here I was, a 19-year-old kid, 2 years away from getting a college degree, a kid who grew up homeless and in foster care because I was in the US. So I started changing my perspective on the suffering that I was going through. And I changed my major to political science because I learned more from that one class than I learned from any other class I took in college. And that was the pathway that I ended up going. So I became a poli-sci major, and while I was continuing down that path, I was working 3 jobs at once while I was at college. And it was very difficult because I remember that I was, many times still feeling like I can't do this, all the pressure that's on me to get this degree. So, and I had to try to bring up my GPA because my GPA from when I transferred was poor. So I just set many goals for myself, and I thought, you know what, don't try to get a 4.0, don't even try to get a 3.0. Just get a GPA high enough that it's a respectable GPA and get a college degree. Because even to get a college degree as a foster kid is a huge accomplishment. So I set mini goals. I said, that is enough. But even that mini goal of getting a degree still was grandiose for me. So then I made daily goals. And every day I would get up and I made myself a promise that if I put my feet on the floor and I walked up that hill to class, that really was a very high hill to class, and I finished what I had to do that day, I would be one day closer to my goal. And while I was doing this and I was taking these classes, I really started understanding about politics. And I'm not going to talk about politics. I'm just going to talk about the definition of politics. So I learned what the definition of politics was. The definition of politics is the allocation of resources. Makes sense, right? Politics is the allocation of resources. Why do people run for governor or mayor or any other position? In politics, they want to be the one in charge of the resources, right? This makes sense. So when I learned that, I thought, who are these people? And how have they made these decisions about my siblings and I, and that they really didn't care about us? They didn't put like any type of effort to keep us together or keep us safe. Who are they? So as I'm learning about politics and government and public policy, I made a commitment to myself. I said, one day, I want to be the one in charge of the resources. I just have to figure out how to get there. So now I'm fast forwarding. So I ended up graduating and working in the world of public policy for several years. And I had very good jobs because of the internships and other things I did at this amazing SUNY school that I was at with very supportive professors. And several years out, I decided that maybe I should apply to law school. Now, it's not something I ever thought of as a child. You don't even think you're going to survive a year later. Now, and if I did, and if I was going to survive a year later, I want to end up being a singer or a world-class gymnast. I wasn't thinking about being a lawyer. So it wasn't even something I thought about in law school because no one's encouraging you to do that. No one's even telling you that you could do that. It's not even, you don't grow up in foster care or homeless and think that one day you're going to be a lawyer. So it wasn't something that I ever thought of or prepared for. And so when I went to apply to law school, I was only going to go at nighttime because I had to work still during the day. You know, I had to pay my rent. I applied to all the law schools in the New York metropolitan area, including in New Jersey, that had a night program. And I was rejected from all of them except for one. I was accepted into Seton Hall Law School, but it was conditional. And they had a program that they called LEO, the Legal Educational Opportunity Program, where you had to take 2 months off from work, take leave, and actually go to a camp, a law camp. It was really at the law school, and I called it like the affirmative action boot camp. And you had to go to this boot camp for 2 months, and it was very difficult to take leave because I still had to pay rent. And the first day that we were all in there, because I was accepted into this program, and we found out only the students that were accepted into this program they didn't have a good enough GPA or LSAT to get into the law school, but they had one or the other, and they had a story. So they picked those that had one or the other, but had a story, to go into this boot camp. And they told us the first day that we know that you were rejected from every law school that you applied to. Otherwise, you wouldn't have taken 2 months off to come to this boot camp, which is true, but we're giving you a chance. We're going to give you a chance. And if you go through this and you follow the rules and you do everything you're supposed to do and you get a B, you'll get admitted into the law school, which is ultimately what happened. So for the next 4 years, I was working full-time during the day in New York, and I was going to law school in Newark, New Jersey at nighttime. I was working full-time, and then at nighttime when I went, it was like 6 to 9:30, Monday through Thursday for 4 years. And on the weekends I studied. And again, it was very, very dark times. And I graduated when I was 29 years old in May, took the bar in July, and was stalking my mailman in November. Because back then, we didn't get emails that we passed the bar. We actually got things in the mail. And if we got a really thick envelope, it meant that you failed and you had to apply again. And if you got a thin envelope, it meant that you passed. So I knew that the letters were coming, and I literally didn't go to Thanksgiving. Like, I just stayed, and I was in the city, Manhattan at that time. I stayed there. I just waited, every day for the postman to come. And he walked in, and I was standing in front of my little box, and he handed me the mail, and it was a thin envelope. And I started crying and hyperventilating, crying, and just sat on the floor. Because at that moment, I had 30 years of trauma and just anxiety and the desire to survive and the struggle just fall right out of me. Because I realized that after I passed the bar, that for the rest of my life, all I ever have to do is work one job. So later on, after getting that job, I stayed in the public sector for a little while, and then I went back to the private sector for 8 years, had a fantastic job. I was a partner in a law firm. And then in November 2011, a friend of mine ran for county executive in Suffolk County, the county I grew up in. And that county has 10,000 employees, a $3 billion budget, and 1.5 million people. It's larger than 12 U.S. states. 12 U.S. states do not have that capacity. And he ran for county executive, and he won. And he asked me to be his chief deputy. And I was like, really? You want me to help you run the county that raised me as a homeless kid? Guess who had the resources now? So we were in office and for 2 weeks, and somebody dropped a newspaper on my desk. And when you first go into this, you work on the transition team, you try to transition in. The most important thing when you go to any new job is where the bathroom is, how to put the computer on, and how to put the lights on, right? everything else, the substance will kind of fall into place. So I was there for 2 weeks, and somebody puts a copy of Newsday on my desk. And Newsday is a Long Island newspaper. There's really one newspaper that's island-wide on Long Island, is Newsday. And they put a copy on my desk, and because Newsday was profiling the Intel semifinalists. It does this every year. This is not a big deal. Every January they profile all the Intel semifinalists in all the different schools on Long Island. But on the cover of Newsday today was a young woman named Samantha Garvey. And the reason why she was profiled on there is because Samantha was living in a homeless shelter with her 2 younger twin siblings and her parents. And she was telling the journalist that she knows that the only way out of poverty was education. And she was trying to set example to her younger siblings. And I was reading this story and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, she's here in Suffolk County. So quickly got on the phone with everyone I needed to, and we realized we actually had one house in the county that was a school district away that we could offer them. And what I mean by that is that we have 5 subsidized houses. That's not a lot, but 4 of them families were living in. But we had one that wasn't, and I asked, why not? You know, I asked the folks who were running that department why no one was living in this house, and they said, well, the last person that was living in it who was about to get evicted was angry and like tore the inside apart. I was like, okay, but she's living in a homeless shelter. I mean, how bad can the inside of this house be if she's living in a homeless shelter? So we kind of went back and forth and then worked everything out logistically that we needed to with the superintendent of the schools. We went out to the house and we realized it could actually be renovated in 2 weeks. So that night, my boss, Steve Malone, put out a press release. We announced that we're going to be giving Samantha keys to the house in 2 weeks. The story went worldwide. By the next morning, everyone literally came out of the woodwork, and I really mean it. I mean, we had people like offering to give carpet for free as long as Samantha came out and picked out the carpet, a new roof, like all this other stuff to modify the bathroom. So we were getting all these free donations as well, and then free furniture and all this other stuff. So we had the press conference. We said, okay, in 2 weeks we're going to hand the keys over. Well, we thought that was it. Apparently not. In the meantime, for those 2 weeks, Samantha was invited to the White House to go to the State of the Union. She was invited on the Ellen DeGeneres show and got a $50,000 scholarship. I wasn't invited. I wasn't invited to the White House either. So while she's traveling all over, because people love this kind of story, she came back 2 weeks later and we were able to hand her the keys to a newly renovated house. That was a subsidized house, so her parents still had to pay, you know, what they had to pay, and we figured it out based upon their salaries. But I thought, you know, and that was just 1 month after being in this job, and I thought, this is it. Like, this is going to be so difficult to run this massive county, but I had the one opportunity to really make an impact on a child's life, and I did it. If it comes up again, great, but I know I did the right thing because I had the resources available to me. What I didn't realize is that 10 months later, our county would be hit by Superstorm Sandy, and we had several deaths, but all of a sudden we had hundreds of families that were suddenly homeless. And it was my job in the immediate aftermath of Sandy to find these suddenly homeless families homes. It was the job of the kid who grew up homeless in this county. That's the story of Etched Sand. It's a story of perseverance, tenacity, and optimism, and how no child is a lost cause. So I'm going to tell you the 2 reasons why I wrote the story. The first is that there are over 400,000 kids in the U.S. foster care system any given year. At least 26,000 of them age out to nobody but themselves at the ages of 18 or 21, depending on what state they're in, depending on what the conditions are. And many of them end up homeless. In fact, there was a recent study that half of the homeless population in the U.S. are former foster children, and a third of the incarcerated are former foster children. Do you remember how I told you I stole food to eat when I was younger? We were never arrested. No one ever called the cops. And I'm pretty confident that's because they saw a bunch of little kids stealing food to eat and they looked the other way. But if I was that 18-year-old that ended up being kicked out of my foster home without any resources and I went to go steal food, the police would have been called, no one would have bailed me out, and that would have started my journey in the criminal justice system. And this is what happens to our youth. This is what we do as a country if we don't get them a safety net, a safe adult connection, or get them a parent when they age out. We just give them independent living skills and kind of wish them on their way. I also wrote the book for the millions of kids out there who are abandoned and abused, because we've got over 1 million of them in the U.S., and also those are homeless as well. I wrote it for all of them just to tell them, I know you have been dealt a bad hand. You really have been dealt a bad hand. And that's what they think about all the time. When kids grow up in this situation, they're constantly looking around and wondering why this one grew up in that family, and I was born to this family. Like, how did that happen? So as they're asking themselves that they're having why they're dealt this hand, I want to say, yes, you're dealt it. But be grateful you're dealt it here in the US, because there are enough resources to pull yourself up and out. And I want to show you how to do it. And I try to show them how to do it through public schools, public libraries, going to public subsidized college, working several jobs at once. Don't make these grandiose goals, just do little goals. How to get through the day, make a promise to get through the day. So if you get through that day, it'll be a day closer to your goal. Use EOP programs, use affirmative action programs, use whatever programs are out there. Open up every single door that you can. Even if it's going to be slammed on you, one day someone's going to open up that door and keep it open, just like my law school that I went to. And I try to give them all these examples. But the reality is that we can't expect our youth in need to be able to figure out how to harness these resources if they don't believe in themselves. And that's the second reason why I wrote Etched in Sand, is because we can impact the life of a child in need. We could do it for that moment in time when they're before us, how we interact with them. We need to understand that we have no control over what happens to them next week. We have no control over their destiny. But we do have control over our interaction with them. And for all those teachers out there that encouraged me, they made a difference. And all those librarians that made a difference. And I have many other people in the book who I didn't get an opportunity to write about that also made a difference. But I'll tell you who also made a significant difference to all the parents in the room here is parents of friends. Because I told you about those parents who told their kids to stay away from me. But I was fortunate enough that there were more parents who, when they found out how I was living, or my siblings were living, they would take us in for a night or for a weekend or for a week. We'd be fed, we'd be bathed, they'd wash our clothes. They try to teach me how to blow my nose. I'd get a toothbrush. But my most important takeaway is that I would be in a home that was a healthy environment, right? I couldn't get taught that in the classroom. I learned how to have a healthy home and be in a healthy home environment by parents or friends taking me in and seeing how they interacted and seeing how at peace they were. All of these are good touches. So I literally had in my life more good touches than bad touches. And I talk about them in my book. And those who gave me bad touches, I changed their name because it wasn't about calling them out, but it was just to show the juxtaposition of how an adult can adversely impact a child in need and how an adult can positively impact a child in need. And I was fortunate enough in my life that I had more good touches than bad touches. And what they did is they gave me options and opportunities. Right? Don't you give your children and your grandchildren and nieces and nephews options and opportunities? And you hope when you show them what they are that they make the right decision and go down the path that you want them to go down. I wasn't related to anyone who did that. They were just people in my life for the short time that I was before them as a transient kid. And there was enough of them that they showed me all the options and opportunities out there. And that's how I ended up going down that path. And those good touches varied. I mean, when I talk about it in the book. I mean, one of the things I would do is I walked around with baby Jesuses in my garbage bags. You know, as a foster kid, you have garbage bags. And you put your stuff in garbage bags when you go from place to place to place. And everyone thinks the most important thing that you have to put in that garbage bag is clothes. And I disagree. It's things. I carried 4 items in my garbage bag for years that were so important to me. 2 of them were baby Jesuses. I didn't know where I got them from, except of course those who already read the book, you know I got the answer in chapter 10. But I didn't know where I got them from, but when I was a little kid, I knew that whoever gave them to me loved me, that I was deserving of love, and to be fed, and to be warm, and to be held. And that's what they remind me of. The 3rd item in there was a picture of my siblings and I. Right after Rosie was born, so it was a picture of all 5 of us. And nothing to me was more important than that. And up until a few years ago, we only had 3 pictures of the 5 of us. And I had one of them. So that was so important to me that I had that. And then the last item I had in there was my 5th grade autograph book. Because when I was in Ms. Vandover's 5th grade class, she too would tell me how smart and talented I was. And apparently every week she would hold a spelling bee. And I won every single week except for the last week. Now haven't gotten over that yet. I even talk about it in the book. But for all those that I won, the winner of the spelling bees would get a Twinkie or a ring ding. So I was convinced that she was holding these spelling bees so she could feed me once a week. So when I left her class, I was heartbroken. And then I had to go on this, horrific journey thereafter. And every time someone would say or do something to me, I would look back at my 5th grade autograph book. And I would look back at what Ms. Vandover wrote, and I would say, well, if she said this about me, could what they're saying be true? That was such a good touch that she gave me, and still to this day, I have my 5th grade autograph book. For a transient kid, it wasn't like going around with much at all. I still have that today. So those are the good touches. And that's what I want to remind all of you for the second reason I wrote Etched in Sand, is the power you have for that moment in time when a child in need is before you. You can forever impact their lives. You have no control over their destiny, no control where they're going to be next week, but you have control how you interact with them and how you can encourage them and build up your self-esteem. So for all of you here who work around youth and are parents and are exposed to any youth in need, I thank you for all that you are doing and that you're going to continue to do as well. So this is my story. These are the 2 reasons why I wrote my book, and I will open it up to questions and answers.
Thank you.
Yes, right back there.
So I wonder, as I hear you speak, you talk about all the people who touched your life. How did you internally decide that you were going to overcome your circumstances rather than become a victim of them?
Thank you. That was a very good question. There are a few variables that played into that. One was I felt responsible for my siblings. We all, the older girls, really felt responsible for each one of us. And I was convinced that if I started sinking, that they may sink, or vice versa. So I always felt like I needed to keep my head above water, needed to move forward so I could continue to help them. So that was something that was very important. If I went through this alone, I don't know if I would have pulled out as well as I did, but the fact that I had them is what made a significant difference. The second is that I just didn't want to be like my mother. And I was just convinced I was going to do whatever I possibly could not to be like her. And the third was, as I said, the good touches. I had so many people telling me that what I can do and what I was capable of. So taking those 3 factors, and combining them is what kept pushing me forward, especially the times when I was giving up. So thank you. There was another question over here? Yes.
Yeah. So thank you so much for your story. And for those of us who love children, want to take care of them, and see the budgets going down everywhere, from the library to the schools, and as a sort of feed into your public policy persona, is there something that we could champion or that you might recommend?
Yes.
That our vote or our presence might be able to influence?
There are two things. One is that if people have time, there's a great way to help kids in need, especially those in the foster care system, and that's a group called CASA. It's Court-Appointed Special Advocates. Are you CASA? Okay. Any other CASAs in the room? All right, wait. Can you all stand up? So let me tell you about CASA, and it's great because then people can go to you to get information afterwards, thank you, is that the one thing I didn't have was a voice. And no one believed me that I didn't have credibility because I was a foster child. And when a foster child goes in and out of the system and appears before court, they are represented by something called CASA, Court-Appointed Special Advocates. And to become one, you don't need a legal background or social work background or educational background. You are trained to represent a youth in court, and it's one youth. Because your goal is to get to know that youth as much as possible. And so by the time you're there and a decision is being made about their future, you are truly the one that's acting in their best interest, and you're giving them a voice. And that's what CASA is. There are guardian ad litems and there are other ones, but the other things, that representation that these kids may have, but the CASA just focuses on the one youth. And when you go through the system, you can correct me if I'm wrong, or you go through the training, they don't just say, well, we're just going to assign you to this child. Usually you're offered like a few, and you kind of select the one that you think you would be most connected with to represent. So that is one. Something locally that is one great thing to do. And by the way, after Etched and Sand, there are so many people who, after they read my book or heard me speak, went out and joined CASA nationwide. And because they realized we didn't have a voice when we were younger, and some of them just literally said they went online and said like voice for foster children. They just like put that in to see like how can they do that, do something. And when they learned about it, they ended up going and joining it. Something else that actually has happened as a result of my book or me talking about the plight of older foster youth is I am constantly getting emails from people about how they've gone out and they've become adoptive foster parents and went out and became forever parents or adoptive parents to older foster teens. And I get pictures and I get stories, and that is another amazing thing besides people joining CASA. But in addition to CASA, there's an organization in Huntington Beach. I spoke in Huntington Beach about 4 months ago. It's called Robin's Nest, and there's a woman named Robin Wood that runs it, and she has a not-for-profit. But she was working in schools in Huntington Beach, and there's a tremendous homeless problem there. And what she realizes is that there's a lot of kids who are homeless who are going to have to move and go to another school. They didn't have resources, or they were in foster care, or they were in bad homes, and they were going to like leave their parents. And she started figuring out what resources are out there to try to help them kind of bridge that gap. And not only that, she found a home nearby that she could rent. But she has these kids like work and kind of pay part of the rent so they can live there. And she has host homes, people that will take in these older youth. And she's done such a fabulous job of what she's done in Huntington Beach. In fact, she had 3 of the girls that she's working with drive up. They all drove up this morning, and I met 3 of the young women. And one of them is who she's been doing this for years, now just finished her associate's degree and is going on for her bachelor's in mechanical engineering because she's been working for a construction company for 2 years. And she wouldn't have been able to do that if she didn't have that safety net that Robin had. So that is something that you could possibly look into and reach out to her, and I could give you her contact information, how that could be emulated here, because what you're doing is you're stepping in for the parent, and you're not looking for money or anything else like that. You're just trying to provide them resources as safety net, and the most important thing is to provide them a safe adult connection, because that's what's going to bridge the gap between where they are now and where we want them to be. And they just need it for a few years, and then most of them hopefully will be off and running, and that's what we're seeing there. So there are a few things you could do. So thanks for asking that question. That don't require like money from government. Yes.
You talk extensively about your sisters, particularly at the end of the book, and where their life, their trajectory. Mm-hmm. What happened to your brother?
My the tough part with that Norman. The challenge that Norman had, and that he still has right now, is that he wasn't abused like we were abused. So here he was, and he was small when he was younger. He was even small for his age. This young boy who had to sit there and watch his sisters be physically abused and sexually abused and couldn't do anything to help them.
I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. He was a young boy who had to sit there see his sisters be physically and sexually abused in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to help them. Because he just couldn't, we weren't individually able to like protect each other. We had to do it as a group. So he was subjected to a lot, because even though it happened to us, my attitude, I'd rather have it happen to me than happen to one of my other siblings, let alone be there and not be the one on the receiving end of it. So that affected him. And that still kind of stays with him now, even though, he's working through and trying to process it. So what I try to do in the book is anonymize him in a way, because I didn't want to, out of fairness for him, because he's still struggling with this. So that's why he's there for a certain while, and then I kind of don't mention him at all. But then when I pick up on, I'm writing Rosie's story, which, by the way, Girl Unbroken, which is the sequel, that's Rosie's story that I wrote with Rosie and my youngest sister, and that book begins when my mother kidnaps them out of the foster home and brings them all the way to Idaho. So you kind of learn her journey. He's much more present again in that book. But the one thing he did do is he had a daughter who's an amazing young woman. She's on full scholarship, going to Boise, Idaho. And that's the wonderful thing about all of my siblings, is that they gave me 12 nieces and nephews. And when they brought them into this world, they haven't repeated the cycle of abuse or abandonment or neglect. And they brought in these youth that are now, some of them are young men and women with kids of their own, that have not repeated the cycle. They're compassionate, and they give back to church and charity. And that, I think, is an amazing accomplishment for all of them, that the next generation, that the cycle was broke. Yes.
When the welfare department was sending your mother checks in You know, couldn't she be trapped by that?
Yeah. Yep. Oh, it was her paranoia. Yeah. I mean, yes, she could still do that by then. But then sometimes, like, we didn't have a mailbox, so she would go to social services and pick it up.
Okay.
So we were there often. We spent a lot of time in the welfare office there because she just didn't have an address or anything, or proof of an address to change her license and that kind of stuff. So sometimes we'd have to go there. Yes, right in the back. There's two, so I'll take one and then the other, right next to each other. The turquoise shirt first. Turquoise.
I really enjoyed your book as well. Thank you very much. One of the things that sort of left me a little uncertain was you talk about this uncle that came back after you had kidnapped Rosie from Idaho and brought her back. This uncle that really advocated on your mom's behalf. Where was this uncle the first half of your life? And why was he such a strong advocate for your mother at this point in her life, but where was he for her the first half?
He wasn't, actually, that whole incident about us taking Rosie from Utah and bringing her back, we don't like to call it kidnapping, we like to call it sister napping. It just has such a much better tone to it. So, anyhow, he was around, but he was just a very undesirable human being. And he would be in and out and around, but my mother, but then other times he would just stay away from her for a long time, just like my grandparents, because she was, you know, she had her struggles, and what she would do, she'd always be asking them for money and say that she needed it for us, when the reality is she would take whatever that they would give her, and then she'd go off on drunken binges, and they felt at a certain point they just have to stop enabling her, and they just cut her off. So they were not, like my grandparents were non-existent really in my younger life, and my uncle, once in a while, he'd be in and out, but he was not all that present either, and when he was just not a nice guy, and he would threaten to beat us up also. And he would constantly tell me, mostly how stupid I was, and how dumb I was, because I think I was a pretty mouthy young kid. and he wanted to like put me in my place, but I wouldn't let him. So anyway, but besides that, he just wasn't a good guy, you know. But they did try once in a while, but because they felt they were enabling her, then they would pull back. And there was another question right next to you.
Well, in the book, I could see how much love between the siblings. But I was wondering, do you think that was just natural for you, or did you learn it from the other families you saw?
Great question. The question was, there's so much love between my siblings and I, and how did we figure that out? How did we learn the emotion of love to even share it? Because we certainly weren't getting it from our mother. And I was very fortunate that the first few years of my life, I was in two very loving homes, and they were extraordinarily formative years. And first, I was abandoned, as you know, with my aunt and my two older sisters. And I'm sorry if that was a spoiler alert for those who didn't read the book. But I was abandoned with a family member and with my two older sisters for a long time. We don't know how long exactly, but it was long enough. She was the one who gave me the baby Jesuses, and where we were loved there, we were fed, we were around all these other kids, we were in this really healthy home environment. And then when social services found out we were abandoned there, they took us out of that home and put us in a foster home. That was just a lovely, lovely foster home, and we were there for a while as well, just my two older sisters and I. So we had the opportunity to learn love there, and I think that basis of me being in that environment for the first few years of my life, leading up to the time when I was placed back with my mother, is what gave me perspective that what my mother was doing was wrong, because I knew how things should be, and I was comparing it to her. And that's what really made a difference for all of us, because we were learning love then, we were learning how to keep house then, how to have order. And the three of us used that. So every time there was chaos in our world, because we would get uprooted, we would try to make every new place that we had a home to insulate my younger siblings as well. And it was learned from that young experience. I mean, they really had a great impact on us. Thank you. Yes?
Given all your mother's issues, of which there were many, why do you think she always seemed to want to enroll you in school? To me, there are so many times parents who have issues like your mom, that's not important to them. But she did enroll you in school sometimes.
So, well, when we would get, but we were out and about during the school day, people would ask us. We would have truant officers, like, would come to our door and ask us why we're not registered in school. I mean, that still happened back then, so she felt like she had to be registering us in school. And in another way, it was one way that she didn't have to worry about, like, where we were, during the day. Not that she worried about too much either, but it would just get us out of the house, which is what I think, when she was around. Yes?
I was just wondering, your story is when so much of it sort of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps kind of story, and you do mention a lot of the big touches and the good things, but a lot of people use stories like yours to say, well, why doesn't everybody do that? Just wondering if you get that, or how you feel about that.
And that's exactly where I go back to the second reason why I wrote my book, is that how can we expect our youth in need to figure out how to do this on their own if they don't believe in themselves, if they don't have people around them, safe adults encouraging them. And sometimes a lot of our youth in need just have parents that are working so hard, and they're working 24/7, and they're just not there to do it. So there are others, and maybe in that child's life, that can be doing it, and others just don't have parents. But that's what literally makes the difference, is like, we can't expect, just because the resources are there, that our youth are going to figure out how to harness them. They've got to believe in themselves, and they have to be directed on how to do that. I didn't know how to go to college. I didn't know about AP classes or SAT classes. I mean, so that's just a reminder to remind everyone, no child's a lost cause. And but how do we prevent them from being one? We somehow play a role in their lives in whatever way that we possibly could. And that's the real difference there. Yes?
So when I was an active CASA person, family reunification up in the Bay Area is huge.
Yep.
I think it's huge. It must have been huge, and I just never understood that. I mean, reading your book, you're just going, oh my gosh, she got the kids. Again, we have, 3 deaths in Lancaster, and just recently in LA County, where the child is returned again and again to be, and the same thing happened to you. I don't understand the reunification. I think California, anyway, I don't know about the other states, has been just huge for the last 30 years on reunification, even after a parent has done all of this stuff.
I know. I think it's about money. I've said this a lot. When you, every counties, I mean, I know in New York State, and I don't know, is it run by the social service system, is that run by counties here as well? Or is it the state?
Yes.
Because Florida, that's the state runs it there, but the counties, public policy is made on the county level that the goal is reunification. And when I hear that word, I think it's a code word for saving money, because if a child, and listen, I've worked in government, I've helped run governments, I get like how policy is made, but if a child is unified with the family, you have one less child on a caseworker's docket, or the whole sibling group is no longer on a caseworker's docket. You don't have a county lawyer that's working with that child anymore. It's not on the judicial docket. And all the other resources that are going into paying a foster parent to take care of these kids, you're not paying that anyway. So it's actually, there's a cost savings to it. And so when I hear it, that's what I think. So I don't think reunification should be a policy. I think it should be a case-by-case basis. There are plenty of families that get their act together where the children should be brought back to the family, but there plenty aren't. And when that's a just blanket policy, that's when it concerns me, just the way that it concerns you as well. Because I think why would this even? How could you have this as a policy? It needs to be whatever is in the best interest of the child. So that's what my thoughts are on it. Hi.
Here in Camarillo, I know the couple who are in charge of the food pantry on Mobile, and there are many, I don't know how many, there's 200 or whatever families that use the food pantry, many of whom are homeless. And one way to help is to contribute to the food pantry.
Yes. Thank you for that so much. It's very true. And one of the things that you should also be contributing to the food pantry besides food are things that are really expensive. And It could be toothbrushes. It could be, toiletries, toilet paper, things like that we know that we have to spend money on. Diapers, because people give food, but you have all of these other items that they need. A clean towel, like a clean washcloth. I know people put together backpacks for poor kids before they go to school, and they put pencils and notebooks. I'm like, no. Can you just give them washcloths and towels, maybe a new blanket, a pillow? These are things that they just don't, they just don't get. There are other things that we could be giving them besides just these school items, because yeah, they're going to need them anyway, but those are easier to get. So when people give, they don't always think about these other items that are out there as well. So thank you for raising that. That is a fantastic thing that people can do to actually help out.
Wipes, all these other things.
All of that, absolutely. Everything related to just hygiene. That all the hygiene stuff. We know on a daily basis how much we pay when we go to a local drugstore. We go in there for one thing, we come out with 12. We pay a lot of money, so they can't do that. So that's a fantastic idea. So thank you for that. In the back.
Can I just say one thing, that the CASA office for Ventura County is here in Camarillo.
Oh.
We're in the Ventura County Community Foundation building, so.
Okay, so the CASA office is here in Camarillo. In the what building?
The Ventura County Community Foundation building on Mission Oaks, next to the Camarillo House.
Got it. I think everyone here heard that. So if you're interested in doing that, that's great. Thank you. And I also want to just, before I take your question, is also thank the Foster VC. Are you here? Is anyone here from Foster VC? There's an organization out here. What they have been doing in coordination with the Camarillo Reads is they held a workshop last week around the themes in Etched and Sand, where they're trying to, talk to potential foster parents and others who are interested in the foster care community. And I understand you even had your youth speak as well, as far as their experiences in there as well, in the foster care system. So if anyone's interested in being a prospective foster parent, or even going through the process of just getting certified, so if ever something comes up, you're ready for that, and it's not too difficult, I would recommending seeing foster VCs. They also have a table outside. So your question in the back?
I guess in your book you cover all of this, but the part I guess the question is, there has to be some kind of emotional, mental transition that you went through while all this was going on, and you healed obviously, but did you go through any type of therapy or anything else to help you get to that point, or totally self?
No, I should have gone to therapy. I never did. I looked down upon it as a teenager. It was a different time. It was the 1980s, and then as I kept growing, I never really had the time to seek the therapy that I should have gotten. So I pulled through in different ways, and a lot of it was just tenacity and pulling through, but I regret not doing that. So I think it's, what was that?
I thought it was admirable that you didn't do it, that you did when you got where you are now with alcohol. I was just amazed at it.
Thanks. Thanks. Thank you. Any more questions? Because we could go to book signing. We've got two more. So one back there, and then I'll take you next. Go ahead.
So you're obviously a miracle, because there are so many people who didn't suffer as much as you and your siblings did, and they walk around and they can't let go, and they're just so unhappy as adults. My question is, I don't know, is it easier today than it was when you were in that situation? Is the foster care more helpful today, or is it as prevalent? Is the situation as
There are some things that have changed. One of the things that has changed is that we have background checks for foster parents. It's a great thing to have, right? But besides that, there was a law that was passed in the 1990s that has been amended several times since that actually has changed the foster care system nationally, and it's mandated. And one of them is called kinship care. So that if there is someone in this child's life who is related to them that is willing to take them in, they will hurry up and be certified. Like, they don't have to go through the class. There would just be a background check on anyone 18 or older in the house. And these children can be placed with a family member. It could be aunt or uncle, or cousin, whatever it is. So at least there's some type of consistency there, as opposed to being placed in the home of a stranger. So kinship care is something that was mandated.
It's easier because of social media now to connect.
You mean to find potential? Well, usually they will have, like, some relatives, they'll ask the kids, or they'll ask the parent, like, who else is in this child's life that would like to do it, that, you know, like to be this with this child. And they tried it more, and now laws have passed that have required that if a child is homeless, that they stay in the same school. If they're put in foster care, they're in foster care, that they still be placed in foster care in the school district. It depends on, you know, what state you're in. So at least is now providing them consistency where they're not being moved around a lot. And there is more of an objective to keep siblings together. That is something that has really been, a key priority, is to keep the siblings together. And that's usually state by state or county by county, but that is something that is pretty crucial. There are, from a societal perspective, not a legal perspective or policy, people are now having blended families more so than they ever did before. It's acceptable to have blended families. So you see a lot more children in foster care being adopted out of foster care, which is great. But you still have the issue of the older foster youth who are aging out, and that is the one thing that I will say that just has not changed. And because of the numbers that are there and how many kids our youth keeps ending up in foster care. But there was a law passed in New York, which I found was so interesting 2 years ago, that actually expanded kinship care to any adult that the child knows. So before, right, my teachers, I'm sure I would have had tons of teachers that would have said, we'll take her, right? We would have never been able to be placed there. Now, an adult that's a safe adult in this youth's life, the child can now be placed with them. They'll be quickly certified for kinship adult care, whatever it is, connection care, and at least again the child will be in a place that they're not going to be with strangers anymore. You know, because going into foster homes is traumatic enough, being removed from your situation, sometimes removed from your siblings, but then going into a strange house and not knowing what to expect. So there have been some really positive changes, but then there have been some things that haven't changed. And I think the issue with older foster youth is that it takes human capital. It takes time to find a youth a safe adult connection. You have to get to know this youth. You have to find those safe adults in their life and start helping formulate that adult connection that they have, whether it's going to be someone who's a forever parent or a adoptive parent or someone who's just going to take them in and mentor them like Robin from Robin's Nest does. And I'll just tell you the difference between a forever parent and an adoptive parent. I'm a forever parent, and I had met a 21-year-old youth. Her name is Brazanne. She was through an organization that I was a board member of, You Gotta Believe, where we work to get older foster kids adopted. And she was just turned 21. She put herself through college at a 3.5 GPA, full scholarship, and was a certified home health aide. Anyone want her? Right? She was kicked out of her foster home because she turned 21 and they weren't going to get money for her anymore. And she contacted You Gotta Believe because she was looking for a mom and dad and 2 younger siblings. That's what they all want, by the way. You ask a foster kid, they all want a mom and dad and 2 younger siblings. And she said she didn't know she could have a family. She heard about our organization, can we get her a family? And I started mentoring her because I realized how close she was to failing and how close she was to succeeding, right? She's now kicked out. She's homeless at this point. And she was still going to school. So I just started mentoring her and being that safety net for her until she finds that family that she was looking for, because I couldn't, provide her the mom and the dad, the 2 younger siblings. It wasn't part of my package. And throughout this process, we started bonding, and she asked me to be her forever mom. Now I'm her forever mom, and she has a safe place for the rest of her life. She has a safety net. She's been with me for 4 years. She's now moved out. She's finished her bachelor's. She's applying for her master's. She works as a full-time job as a caseworker. All she needed with those few years. So that could have went one way or the other, and now she's off and living on her own in the city and working. And so that there are like a variety of different things that can be done with older youth that doesn't require just adoption and things along that line, but she will always have that safety net. And that's not not something, again, that is not necessarily done through the child welfare system, because it takes time to learn about this child and find adults out there that are interested in doing that. So that's why they end up living on their own and then ended up in situations where they are. I'll take the question in the back, and then over here, sorry.
Mine's actually a comment. When talking to the kids, I'd like to invite everybody to look at our website, because we do have plenty of resources where people can volunteer if they're not able to take a child into their home. You're also able to be a host home, like she was just explaining now, to help the children succeed. We do also have a program that helps them pay for college. We give them laptops, so we do help our children succeed, but we can't do it alone. And that's one of the reasons we're so excited to be here, because with Etched and hearing the story now, I know all the background, and I'm going to tell you, I work every day with these youth, and what we strive to do is to put them in familial homes because of the new state laws. We don't want them in group homes, but we're looking for homes that can actually give them the home, give them the voice, and give them the support they need so they can be successful adults and break that cycle that they've been raised in. And if you, outside, I have different ways that you can volunteer. You can even be involved with your churches. We have so many different ways. CASA is always the best, though, because I'm going to tell you, they walk alongside our children and they are their voice every day. It's amazing. So anybody who has the time and you're interested, look at our website or come outside. I have bags with all the information, so I'd just like to invite you to help our children, because right now we have about 900 children who need homes in this county and Missouri.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question, and then we'll go for a book signing.
In Girl Unbroken, you revealed that Rosie had been diagnosed, I believe, bipolar.
Yes.
It seems to me all of you must have suffered from PTSD.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Could you repeat the question, please? We can't hear.
Repeat the question.
She didn't ask the question yet. She was just saying a statement, but I'll repeat what she said, and then I'll repeat the question when she asked it. Is that in Girl Unbroken, you learn that Rosie is bipolar, my younger sister is bipolar, and that my mother is bipolar, so it's hereditary. And she had said, besides that, it's likely that we all suffered PTSD. And so you want to take it from there.
Well, I'm just amazed that you all went on to be so successful and overcame that beginning. I was just wondering if you had any comments.
And then she said she's surprised that we all went on to be successful and were able to overcome what we were exposed to when we were younger. And so what I have to say to that is that we all did it independently and collectively, meaning that we all had to go down our own path to survive and keep our own heads above the water, but we still try to kind of stay close if we had the ability to actually stay close and pull through it. And we were all affected. We're all affected in different ways, and we all definitely still have PTSD in some capacity. Well, I will speak for myself in that. I don't want to speak for my siblings. But there are also health issues. When a child suffers toxic stress and trauma as a child, if anyone in the room here knows something called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, it is a list of 10 questions that are being asked by Kaiser Permanente and many other groups that are out there of adults. And the questions are basically if you suffered trauma as a child, and the more yeses, the more affirmative answers, the more likelihood that you're going to have long-term health issues because of the stress that you suffered as a child. And we do have that. And I mean, my siblings and I can answer yes to all 10 questions. I mean, affirmatively to all 10. And so we do have some of that. And that's interesting because we're just starting to learn about ACEs and toxic stress and the impact that has on kids. And we can look at each other, and now we better understand why it is that some of us have like significant health issues that we actually have. So there is, even though when I say, my siblings are successful, I look at the fact that they brought in the next generation. But it doesn't mean that they weren't adversely affected by it, but it means that their kids aren't that they were wise enough to make sure that they're not repeating that cycle, that it doesn't continue on. Thank you. So that was the last question. Thank you so much for being here. Let's do a book signing outside.